So this site, which is excellent, called XDA, has gone through 7 reasons why your frame rate is lower than it could be. Let's go through these one by one, starting with number 7. Background applications. You do not want to have a lot of applications running in the background because it's going to use up a lot of memory and maybe potentially a fair amount of CPU usage. And if that is happening in the background, it's going to take away from your performance in whatever game that you are playing. So what you can do if you're on Windows, you can go into Startup, and within Startup, it will show you the things that are loading when you load into Windows, and you can remove some of these applications that are starting because you will be surprised at how many are there. Maybe all your launchers are loading, right? Like GOG and Epic and Steam and all the rest of it. And if you're playing an Epic game, for example, you don't need to have all the rest of them loaded unless you have a ton of memory. And speaking of memory, I would recommend at least today in 2025 having 32 gigabytes of system memory, and that will mitigate some problems. Also, if you have a browser open, let's say Google Chrome, and you have 15, 20, 30 tabs open, even though Google Chrome does utilize memory a little bit better than before, it will eat up a lot of that memory. VRAM limitations is also a concern. Insufficient VRAM will mean that your game will stutter much more because, as we know, the Unreal Engine stutters anyway, no matter how much VRAM you have. But if you run out of VRAM, it is going to stutter like crazy, and you're also going to get decreased frame rates. Now, I would recommend, if you're purchasing a video card in 2025, get one that has the bare minimum of 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, as I mentioned before, having 32 gigabytes of system memory is going to help out overall. However, you might have that much memory or more, but you don't have a certain memory profile enabled. So make sure you go into your BIOS to enable Intel's XMP, if your memory can do that, or AMD's EXPO profile. Once you do that, your memory performance will jump up quite a bit, and you'll be surprised. If you have fast memory in your system, boy, I tell you, it does make a lot of difference. And there's no point, of course, not enabling these profiles if you have a very high-end video card, a high-end board, and a high-end everything. If you don't enable this, this is going to be somewhat of a bottleneck for you. Now, here is a very important point. Your GPU drivers might be out of date, so make sure you update them. However, I would not recommend going out and getting the latest, the bleeding edge, just released video card driver, because a lot of times those drivers have problems unless there is a specific game and you need to have the latest driver for that game. You're kind of forced, right, to at least cross your fingers and hope that it's going to work. And that goes for AMD, Intel, or NVIDIA. So do some research when you're thinking about updating your video card drivers. A good place to do that would be, for example, on Reddit. So keep your GPU drivers up to date, but I wouldn't recommend necessarily bleeding edge unless you really have to. Now, this is also a valid point. Is your game installed on a mechanical hard drive? Because if it is, it's going to be, well, slow. Really slow. It's going to load the game really slowly. It's going to save it really slowly. So if you have a system, maybe your primary drive is an SSD, you ran out of space and you put it on a hard drive, and then you're finding your game is slow, that's the reason right there. Make sure if you have an SSD to put all of your games on that SSD and not on the mechanical hard drive. I get it. These drives are affordable and there's lots of storage, but they are terribly slow. And if you don't have an SSD installed in your computer, if it's a laptop or a desktop, you can rip out your hard drive and you can put in an SSD, and the transformation is going to be insane. As a matter of fact, going from a mechanical hard drive to an SSD is one of the surefire ways to make your system overall tremendously faster. Now, this one is a bit of a no-brainer. In-game settings are set too high. Maybe you have a lower end or a middle-of-the-road video card, and you go into the game and you set everything to epic or ultra, enable ray tracing, and you go, how come I'm only getting 20 frames per second? That's why. Go in, just tweak things, and it's amazing what you can do sometimes. Sometimes these ultra and epic settings, by the way, don't make visually much of a difference overall, and even if you have a higher end video card. Now, I am certainly guilty of that. The first thing that I do is go into the game display settings and max everything out, including ray tracing if it is in the game. And sometimes even with a 4090, it's a little on the slow side, 40 maybe to 50 something frames per second, and you really want to hit a target of over 60 frames per second in a game. So it's amazing how demanding some of these new game engines are, like for example Unreal Engine 5, and you might find yourself, for example, in these games, in some areas you're getting 80 plus frames per second with all the eye candy on, and in some areas you're getting 30 frames per second, and I guess it's up to you whether you can tolerate that or not. But if it's in a game that is competitive, like PvP, for example, that's not a good situation. So just tweak the settings to your, preferences. Now, the last one here is GPU power. When you install your video card, it, of course, will go to a default power setting. But you can increase the power that's supplied to your GPU. Be careful when you do that because you could overheat it. If you increase the power to the GPU, the clock speeds will be a little bit higher. Now, the other option to this is to do it manually, increase the power limits, and then go ahead and overclock the core and the memory. You might be able to get 5 or 10 frames per second more out of your existing video card by doing so, but be careful because it could overheat the video card, and if that happens, it's going to throttle back, and it's going to be worse than if you left it at default. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you in the next one.